So the man who needs no introduction, especially not in this crowd, Oliver Hart.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak here and to be at this conference. The only challenge I face is that some of the things I was going to say have already been said. So there's going to be some repetition. I can only be grateful that I'm speaking today rather than tomorrow when Benk's speaking, because then even more would have been said. Let me start by saying I first met Henry in 1979. I was visiting Penn, the Wharton School, for a semester. And at the time, Sandy Grossman and I were working on takeover bids and the free rider problem. And Henry very generously suggested that we might come to his house one evening and he would invite some of his colleagues from the law school, and we would, we would tell them about our work and they would give us some comments, and it all sounded very exciting. And Sandy and I went to his house, and Henry was there, and we sat there for a while and nobody showed up. So we decided maybe wasn't much point having a discussion. So I think, I seem to remember Sandy and I went off to a concert that evening. But after that slightly disappointing start, although I was very grateful that, Henry had had the idea, but, after that, my interactions with him became better. And over the years, we've had so many, from my point of view, very interesting conversations, very rewarding conversations. And so, that gives me, that's one of the reasons it's a particular pleasure to be here today. So the book, I get here, I'm going to repeat what a number of people said, but I think, sometimes repetition is good, particularly when it's truth that's being repeated. There's no fake news here. So, most articles or books that one reads 25 years after they were written don't look as good as they first did. And that is decidedly not the case for Henry's book, The Ownership of Enterprise. I remember being dazzled by it the first time around 25 years ago, and then preparing for this conference, I read it again, and I felt exactly the same way. I was dazzled again. It's not only immensely enlightening, but as has been pointed out, beautifully written. So, the book makes the vitally important point that capitalism, where firms are owned by the providers of capital, is not the logical consequence of free markets and free enterprise. Even in the bastion of capitalism, the United States, capitalist firms are not as common as many people, in particular many economists, think. In spite of this penetrating observation, it is nonetheless true that many of the largest and most important firms in the US and elsewhere are investor-owned. And Henry has an explanation for this, which we've heard. But let me say it again, I'm going to quote him. Investor-owned firms have the important advantage that their owners generally share a single well-defined objective to maximize the net present value of the firm's earnings. The costs of collective decision-making are thus relatively low for investor-owned firms. This is not to say that there is no room for conflict among a firm's owners. So I would like to pick up on that last sentence. This is not to say that there's no room for conflict among a firm's owners. Economists have been aware for a long time that the conditions for shareholder unanimity are quite restrictive. You need perfect competition, complete markets, and a number of other things. But speaking for myself, I always regarded the departures from unanimity to be second order. So sure, there can be shareholders of a firm who consume its product, and maybe they would favor a low price rather than high profits. Or there can be people who work in the firm who are shareholders, who might favor high wages over high profits. There can be shareholders with different attitudes to risks. Some of them might favor riskier investments, some might be more cautious. But how important are any of these things in practice? To me, they seemed sort of second order. My thinking on this has changed in the last 5 years or so because of ESG. I think with respect to ESG issues, A, net present value maximization may not be the appropriate objective for the firm. B, shareholders may not agree on the right objective. And C, the departures are first order. And here I'm talking about work I've done with Luigi and also more recently with Eleonora Brocado. Now, I'm going to illustrate with a real-world example. Now, you can see that coordination between co-authors is sometimes not perfect. And in this case, I think it was non-existent because Luigi's already talked about the example. But still, I think it's a good example. I want to use it here. And let me say, some of you, I also used this example at an ALEA presentation last week. But as I say, I think it's a good example. So let me just remind you, if you've forgotten what was said before lunch. In 1984, DuPont faced a choice between polluting the Ohio River with a toxic substance known as PFOA and investing in filtration. And Luigi, together with a colleague, Shapira, or co-author, used court documents to do a cost-benefit analysis. So they calculated the present value of the cost of filtration to be $350 million, and the present value of the damage from not filtrating to be $1.1 billion. Okay, so this is the mess is 1.1 billion, and the cost of cleaning up is 350 million, and this is in 1984 dollars. Okay, as you heard earlier, DuPont decided not to filtrate. But I think an interesting question is, suppose you'd ask the shareholders of DuPont what they felt about this. Suppose they could have voted on the decision to filtrate or not filtrate. So I'm going to be thinking about dispersed shareholders or diversified shareholders. So if you now, let's do a current calculation. An average US investor who has, or sorry, an investor, forget average, an investor who has a portfolio which is worth $500,000 and is fully diversified in the US stock market, owns approximately 10 to the minus eighth of the US stock market, which means that they would own 10 to the minus eighth of DuPont. So if they were given this choice, they would reason as follows. Filtration costs $350 million. Okay, I own 10 to the minus eighth of that. So that's the capital loss or the reduced dividend I will experience. And that works out to be $3.5. Okay, filtration yields a net benefit to society. How much is that? Well, the way to calculate that is to say there's the 1.1 billion damage, pollution that is avoided, but there's also the cost that my fellow shareholders bear, which is approximately $350 million. Okay, you should, to be precise, subtract off the $3.5 that I have to pay, but let's ignore that. So 1,100 minus 350 is $750 million. So basically, an individual shareholder is being asked, are you willing to pay $3.5 to create a net social gain of $750 million? I mean, how many people would say no to that? Okay, that suggests to me, to us, to Luigi and me, that if it had been a vote at the time, and putting aside one thing that I will come to now, the vote would have been to filtrate. But that is not what DuPont decided. Why didn't they? Well, you know, one possibility is that they just believed in profit maximization. Maybe they'd read Milton Friedman or other people, or maybe they'd been incentivized, top managers had been incentivized to be concerned about profit or market value. The other possibility is, at the time, there was a significant shareholder, the DuPont family. They owned 20% of DuPont. I don't know what the situation is today, but they owned 20%. And for them, the calculation, of course, looks rather different. 20% of 350 million is 70 million. That's how much comes out of their pocket. And the net social gain is 820 million. Notice that 820 minus 70 is 750, which is the net social gain we had on the previous slide. So that's where that number comes from. Okay, well, you know, being at $3.5 for 750 million is one thing. 70 million for a social gain of 820 is another thing. And maybe, I don't know, you know, the preferences of the DuPont family, but maybe if they'd been, well, maybe they did ask themselves that question, and maybe their, the weight they put on the other people rather than them isn't enough to make them want to make that trade-off. So maybe that's why DuPont made that decision. I can look over there. Okay. So what lessons do I draw from this example? First, socially responsible shareholders may be willing, all right, this is a sort of dual presentation. I'm looking at various things, and it might be easier if I just look at my computer. Socially responsible shareholders may be willing to sacrifice some profit or net present value for the social good. Now, this is, of course, all under the assumption that the government hasn't done the job. And, you know, we were talking about this morning, and obviously, we get resistance to this from people in the audience. And I think Luigi gave a sort of counter argument to them, which I agree with. But the thing is, if you wait for government, was it John Armour who said, if we wait for government to solve the problem, we'll all be dead? And I think that's why, and I agree with what Patrick said, we all have to be working on this. And I think as my calculation tried to show, shareholders can be part of the struggle. And they may well actually end up be willing to make these trade-offs. And in this example, actually, small shareholders are going to be prepared to do that. The decision they make may be closer to what a benevolent social planner would like to do, in other words, the socially efficient decision, than a large shareholder. So in my example, the 3.5 versus 750 million, you say filtrate, which is socially efficient, obviously. 1.1 billion is bigger than 350 million, so it's not even close. DuPont, the large shareholder, the DuPont family might not be willing to make that trade-off because it hits them much more in the pocket. And so actually, this is an example where small shareholders may be better than large shareholders. And we're used to the idea that the biggest challenge in getting corporations to do the right thing is the principal agent problem, managers who don't act on behalf of shareholders. And there's a big literature saying that, large shareholders can help to solve that problem. Here it goes the other way around. Here, large shareholders can get in the way of socially efficient outcomes, and small shareholders actually may do a better job of it. But the other thing is we don't have unanimity anymore. Now, none of this implies that Henry was wrong when he wrote that investors are the natural owners of the firm. The potential disagreement about ESG will not be any smaller among other groups of patrons. I also think, of course, that one of the reasons investors are owners is because they provide capital and they don't have any sort of strong contractual claim, right? They get dividends whenever the firm feels like paying them. And so that's, for me, one of the main reasons why they have votes. The fact that they may disagree less about things than other groups of patrons is important, but I always thought Henry rather underplayed this other rationale for investor ownership. And that's still going to be important, ESG notwithstanding. Still, I think one might want to reconsider the following. So here, actually, maybe here it would be useful if I put up a couple of quotes. So I think one of them, Naomi also used, the first one, but let me just repeat it. Indeed, the basic function served by giving voting control over a firm to a particular group of the firm's patrons is not to provide a means for conveying the patron's preferences to the firm's management, but rather to make it more difficult for the firm to exploit those patrons as a class. That is, to prevent the firm from taking actions that will strongly disadvantage a substantial majority of those patrons. Okay, let me add another one. There is clearly a need for good communication between patrons and the firm, just as there is between citizens and their government. Indeed, a recurrent theme in the management literature has been the need for managers to find better means of listening to their customers, suppliers, investors, and workers. But giving patrons voting control over the firm is not necessarily a good means to this end. Well, here I'm going to respectfully disagree, because I think it is actually important for shareholders to convey their preferences over ESG matters to management, indeed for management to solicit these preferences. As in my DuPont example, if the management of DuPont had gone to the shareholders, then the small ones might have voted to Filtrate. Maybe at the time the DuPont family, 20% would have voted against, but maybe there would have been a majority to Filtrate, and that might have been a good way forward. So, I'm not sure we should sort of minimize the role of that. And I also think, again, as my example sort of suggests, that voting may not be a bad way to resolve these issues. So if there is an ESG matter, is there a better way? Maybe the best thing you can do is to have shareholders vote on it, rather than to kind of shut down voting or minimize voting. And I think that there are signs that the world is moving in these directions. Whoops. Okay, no, that's all right. Sorry, I'm uncoordinated between my own. So what do I said here? Yeah, what I want to say is, right, things are moving in this direction. So here, what do we have? We have the fintech asset management firm Betterment has been asking investors in the partner ETF engine, the partner ETF engine number one. Remember them, they're the ones who had the success with ExxonMobil. So they've been asking investors in this ETF what proxy fights they want the ETF to engage in. So that's an example of a mutual fund asking its investors what kind of, how, in what way the mutual fund should be activist in voting or, putting up things on the ballot. So I think that's an example of trying to get shareholders to reveal their preferences. And, another example on the voting side is that BlackRock is letting some of its investors vote directly on shareholder resolutions and board seats. I'm sure you've read about that. So both these things seem to me to be signs that the corporate landscape is changing. And I hear that people, some of the people here don't like it. But I just think it's inevitable, because I mean, if you think that shareholders, these are the people with the votes, how can you, I mean, should we really shut down this process? It does make the corporate scene, more political. It makes it more like politics, and some people don't like that. They think that, one of the beauties of the way we used to think about things is that we could talk about shareholder unanimity. There was about maximizing profit. That was a single goal. It could be measured. It was very clean. And then we leave all the social, the messy stuff to individual action or politics. And now what I'm saying and what Luigi and I are saying, and what the DuPont example suggests, I think, is that, well, if shareholders do care about other things, then there isn't this separation between money making and the other stuff. It's all combined, intermingled, and I don't think you can avoid it. You can't just shut it down and wish for a world where everybody agreed about profits. I mean, I actually gave a talk like this to some of the Harvard students a few weeks ago, and one of them said, well, but isn't it the case that money is the one thing we can agree about? And I said, yeah, that sounds so great, but it's untrue, because as my DuPont example shows, no, if there's a environmental cost, everybody agreeing about money would be, say, don't filtrate. But in fact, if you ask them and they have any sort of social responsibility, then they're going to take the other factors into account, and then it's not just about money. So I don't see how one can sort of shove this aside. And I think this may be, so I think the corporate landscape is changing, and I think that is actually kind of exciting. Okay, final remark then is that I rather doubt that I'll be able to attend the 50th anniversary of Henry's book in 2046, but I hope that some of you will, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what the corporate landscape looks like then. But in the meantime, thank you, and I'm just delighted to be here, and thank you, Henry, for this wonderful book. Thanks. Do you want to ask a question?
Going back to your example of thought and the possible obstructionism of the family 20%.
Yeah.
There may be a role for a mechanism that allows a default subscription of shareholders. Let's say that by default, the board proposes the following thing: by default, every shareholder is subscribing to pay up to $10 for filtration, and if there are enough subscribers that they meet the 350 million, it will happen. But any shareholder can opt out. And with your hypothesis, the family will opt out and won't have to pay, but maybe you'll get enough of the small people to subscribe. And this would be a way to stop the obstructionism of large shareholders.
It's an interesting suggestion, but I'm not sure I terribly like it for the following reason. I mean, why would you just have the shareholders subscribe to this? This sounds like, I mean, you could go to anybody, right? And once you look at it that way, we have, the classic public goods problem that individuals may want a free ride. They'll think other people can subscribe, and why should I? I think the benefit of a vote is if the majority votes for it, then everybody else has to cough up. So in a way, this is a bit the way taxation works. And it's why we think that sometimes taxation, I think it's the main reason we think we have taxation. It's to solve, well, not the only one, but yeah, it's to solve free rider problems. And that's why I think we need that in the corporate sector. So that's why I think the vote has to be binding on the minority. Yeah.
I thought that the examples, these recent examples of proxy voting leading to somebody coming on the board, was very dependent upon large people in large blocks of stock, pension funds, right? And that in order to understand what's going on, in fact, it's more we're seeing large compilation. People are voting large bunches of shares are critical to having these decisions being made. Now that maybe just pushes the question back one stage. How is it that the pension fund in the state of California can feel it's appropriate to do such things? But it just seemed to me that it wasn't really about small shareholders in fact in the example.
No, I think that's absolutely right. But I think our view would be that that those large investors, and some of them were pension funds, there was Blackrock, there was Vanguard, and the usual suspect. They really should have gone back to their investors, the small people like you and me, and asked us what we wanted, as opposed to voting on our behalf. And that's BlackRock letting some of its investors vote directly, and that came after this, would be a step in that direction. So, I think that would be the way forward. There's some questions over there. Yes.
Hey, Oliver, I'm wondering if you can say a few words about whether people studying corporate voting need to take more seriously some of the largely negative results from social choice theory, or under what circumstances we would actually have much occasion to trust the outcome of the vote as aggregated preferences for language. So it may not just be homogeneity, right? I might be able to be, have more reliance on a heterogeneous group of patrons who at least satisfy single peak preferences or some of these other more conventional social choice desiderata for some type of coherent voting. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because I do think this is an area where people who like to celebrate corporate voting also haven't forced themselves to recognize some of the, quite frankly, negative results of social choice theory.
Yes, Eric. I mean, I think that's a very good point, and one does have to think about that. I think I don't want to maintain that voting is ideal. The question is, what's better? We face the same problem in the political sphere, and people come up with ideas occasionally, and we have now rank order voting when there's more than one issue, and none of this is resolved. But in spite of the arrow impossibility theorem, we still actually do stuff, right? We live, and we have votes, and somehow we live with the outcomes. And but I'm all in favor of people. People should be thinking about the best way of doing it, and maybe there's a better way, and maybe having not exactly, there might be some more interesting mechanism than voting that might to elicit preferences. I mean, I think that might, I don't know what it would be, whether it would be practical, but I certainly think it's worth thinking about that.
So Oliver, how do you deal with the fact that maybe, the thing that everybody agrees upon in your example are the facts, right? So that the cost of avoiding the pollution was X and the social benefit was Y. And this, what motivates the example is that these things are known and not disputed in advance of the voting moment. Now, that probably will be the world a very rare occurrence. And so isn't this is a little bit to follow Eric's point, isn't the fragility of voting also associated with the information condition that the outcome that you suggest, low cost voter, but the social good, et cetera, right?
I can't disagree with that either. I mean, yeah, this is a very simple example. I'm not sure that the numbers were known at the time. We owe them to Luigi, who was barely born at the time, right? So, oh no, but you said that actually DuPont had, I don't know whether they had those numbers.
Cost of filtration was in the document of DuPont at that time.
I see.
The other is assume rational expectation for the next update, of course, at the time.
Yeah, yeah. So,
That's the cost of is based on the impact on human life, etc. This is something that is disputable.
these things will often not be clear cut, Jeff. I mean, I don't deny that, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try, it seems to me. I mean, what's the alternative? Just to ignore these things and say, we look at the bottom line because that's the one thing we can measure, which we probably can't either, right? Knowing the 350 million is also, it's not going to be always clear cut. But you know, it sort of sounds a little like the argument that what's good about profit maximization is you can measure profit more easily than other things. But, you know, as time passes, we're going to be better, I think, at evaluating the social impact of firms. And we may find, you know, there'll be, we'll measure the firm's carbon imprint or something, and that could be disclosed along with the profit figures for the year. And then you can sort of decide whether the firm's doing well or badly.
The department actually put this up for a vote and told everyone that it's going to cost this amount to save this amount of lives and money. The vote may have come out yes or may have come out no, but probably the filter would be there by next year because the Washington Post would run the story about how DuPont knows it's poisoning people or not, and we have a law against this. And so, you know, one thing about the environment that we vote, that management is picking what to frame the issue as, knowing that it has an effect on, regardless of the vote outcome, on the regulatory. So I wonder, the story is a shareholder-focused story, illuminating themselves, but how managerialism plays into the actual picture.
Luigi. Why don't you just come up here so we can hear you? The difficult questions.
I think that if the outcome is that you do what the large public wants because it came out of the Washington Post, that's great. Part of the story is that the manager of DuPont kept this stuff secret for years. And when the first guy sued because his cows were killed by the PFOA, they said he was a bad farmer and he didn't know how to raise cows. And the only reason why all this got exposed is because, speaking of, this farmer had a childhood friend who ended up as a corporate lawyer. And when they reached this corporate lawyer, and this corporate lawyer, out of kindness, took this case, that then took over his life because it took 20 years, but eventually wrote this stuff to justice. And if it wasn't for this lawyer, who was a hero, Robert Billard, we would not know that. And everybody else in the world, because this case that triggered cases in the Netherlands, in Japan, in Italy, because this PFOA has been used all over the world, and the companies using it have kept it secret. So if eventually everything is decided by the Washington Post when this is exposed, I think that's progress versus where we are today.
The last question was how we propose the next time coming up. So that's why I want to know nobody under the Hart thing balance work. Next time it will come. How we dispose come about when nobody knows except for this wonderful statement. farmer and contractor, what would be the mechanism? Are you proposing, are you proposing that there is some rule that requires the management to report any possible issue part of my not, and then who would select which of those
I can take over this difficult question. I think that if you have a major trade-off on issues, like you are the lawyer, but there are some issues in which managers need to ask shareholders what to do, right? So if issues of major impact on the environment, they should ask their shareholders what to do and provide them with information. And if they don't, they violate their fiduciary duty.
And by the way, they could all, the other approach is for them to learn something about their shareholder preferences in advance. So, I mean, the thing is, we have been telling managers for a long time, and business schools have been telling them this and training them in this way, that profit is the thing, is what it's all about. And so, you know, if they question themselves and say, what should I be doing? The answer is profit maximization. You know, then we worry about agency problems that they might be empire builders or whatever. But somehow the big message is that acting on behalf of shareholders means maximizing profit. Now, once you look at it this way, then maybe even if they don't put this issue to the shareholders, they will themselves know that they should be taking into account the pro-social preferences of their shareholders, which they might have learned about. And then maybe they would make the decision differently, even if it didn't come up for a vote. Yeah.
If we want managers to internalize pro-social preferences of shareholders, how do we do that if we're also getting
Well, I think we have to rethink our incentive schemes. I mean, I think that will be the way forward, that we start penalizing them for bad environmental performance or rewarding them for good environmental performance. Sorry, there's no. Well, if you can measure these things more accurately, probably than you can now, but the hope is you will, there'll be some sort of consensus measures of these things, then you could build them into incentive schemes.